Hi everyone, John Monroe here to give some introductory remarks for the racial capitalism themed week of the MA module Globalization since 1945. So we're going to be talking this week about the concept of racial capitalism and a little bit about the book that we'll be reading and these brief introductory remarks I'll give here. This week we're reading Adom Gadachow's World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, a book I really like. And so I hope you get a lot out of it as well. In order to make my introductory remarks, though, I'll say just a little thing about myself is that something I learned in terms of my own pedagogical practice, something I learned during the COVID lockdown, actually, when we really started recording digital content, is that I still find the process speaking to a camera rather than to a live audience with students and interacting. I find it awkward and still a little bit stilted and so on. So one of the ways that I try to kind of cope with that is by taking the lecture outside. There's one thing that I learned that's kind of nice, an opportunity about delivering lecture material or introductory remarks, as I'm doing here digitally, is that it actually gives me a bit of an opportunity to move around. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to go outside and take a little walk and say a little bit more about racial capitalism to set the stage for this week of the module. Okay, more in a minute. Okay, so here I am walking along the Birmingham Canal, heading in the direction away from the city center, which is behind me. I chose to walk along the canal because it has a thematic connection to racial capitalism, a point which I'll come back to. But I'll also say that just generally, part of what I hope is maybe somewhat interesting about filming this lecture content outside as I introduce the week's topic for the 3 weeks that I'll be joining you on this module, is that it might be a little more interesting to have a look at what's going on outside than just looking at me sitting at my desk in front of my computer. And particularly for those students who are part of the distance learning group for this module, and if you live in a different country, it might give you a little bit of a chance to see a little bit of Birmingham at the same time as well. Okay, so let me say a little bit about racial capitalism just to kind of set us up for this week. So the term, it's not coined by Cedric Robinson, by the great political theorist Cedric Robinson, but it's most associated with him, and for good reason. So the term racial capitalism originates out of debates and scholarly discourse in South Africa, a capitalist, settler, colonial society where obviously race plays an enormous role historically and in the present in terms of how power is arranged in that society. So given that that's the case, it's not surprising that debates about the significance and the interrelation between race and class have been quite prominent in the South African literature. So in the 1970s, Cedric Robinson was reading this work, engaging with this work, and then he came to take on the concept of racial capitalism in his book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, which was published in 1983. And that book, I always kind of need to catch my breath when trying to describe this book because it does so many things. But for our purposes and thinking about Cedric Robinson and racial capitalism in the kind of context of globalization since 1945, the topic of our module, I'll say just a couple of things. Noting first of all that I'm really skimming here, and I recommend you have a look at the book when you can. Okay, so what Robinson, in my reading, was doing with the concept of racial capitalism in the book Black Marxism was to level a critique against Marxist thinking, not a critique against, a critique of Marxist thinking of the relationship between race and class. I mean, there's a way that Robinson's work can be read as anti-Marxist. I don't read it that way. I read it as a sympathetic kind of critique that really advances our thinking about the race-class relationship. So what Robinson does in Black Marxism is he he first of all sort of reveals Europe's own racial constitution, the way that race matters in European history, even before 1492. Thinking about the very long histories of anti-Semitism, he doesn't use the term Islamophobia, but anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic kinds of tendencies within Europe, anti-Slavic racism. There's ways that race already sort of organizes the European continent before its expansion into the wider world, particularly after Columbus in 1492. So that's one of the things that he does. But what he's particularly interested in doing is showing how race does not come sort of secondary to class when thinking about the organization of the world. And of course, one of the most significant sort of aspects of the expansion of European power into the wider world after Columbus was racial slavery. The theft of human beings from the African continent brought to forcefully to the Americas and forced to work. So what Robinson is doing is showing how central race is to this whole, massive set of historical processes at a global kind of scale, with a particular focus on the Atlantic world. Secondly, what he's doing is so showing that race matters and showing that Marxist critiques of capitalism have not paid sufficient attention to race, but more than that, they haven't theorized, they've misunderstood. It's not just that they missed something, they misunderstood something in not seeing the ways that race and class have been entangled in their relationship over the centuries. But second to this, Robinson also shows that he doesn't, it's interesting the way he positions himself within this, but what he does is he sort of catalogs a black radical tradition that has, goes the train, a black radical tradition that has itself, out of the world of white supremacy, has already theorized through resistance, through political mobilization, a kind of way of thinking about these categories together. And so Robinson shows how the resistance of the enslaved is already part of a kind of intellectual project to critique white supremacy, as well as a political, social movement, you name it, all forms of mobilization against white racial power during slavery and after. So Black Marxism kind of culminates in 3 chapters on 3 particular individuals, Richard Wright, W.E.B. Du Bois, and C.L.R. James, as exemplars of the black radical tradition. I mean, for many of us, we situate Robinson himself in that lineage as well. So if we're thinking then about the topic of our module, globalization since 1945, thinking about race and thinking about capitalism is very central to the business of what we're here to kind of think through together and discuss. So Robinson's intervention in thinking about critical, takes on capitalism through the Marxist tradition is something that I think really compels our interest. And it's something that we need to arrive ourselves at our own kind of position on. To what degree is race significant vis-a-vis the economic structure, and the reverse? How significant is the economic structure vis-a-vis race? Which is more important? Which comes first? If one is not more important than the other, then how do we explain how they interact, and so on? But in particular, we're not reading Robinson this week. I'm saying quite a bit about him right now because he's really important to just kind of setting up this idea of racial capitalism, and his thought lies very much in the background of what we're looking at this week. But we're reading World Making After Empire. And so this isn't a book that's directly engaged with Robinson. You don't see him at the forefront of Kadachaw's thinking here. But what you do see is, the book itself, World Making After Empire, is kind of a good example of the ways that Robinson's thought is so prevalent throughout several different fields that it's no longer necessary to kind of walk through what I've just kind of tried to sketch out a little bit here, Robinson's contribution in thinking about examples of the Black radical tradition, which is exactly what world making is about. So I won't say too much about the book because you're reading it, and we'll be discussing it for the in-class group in class, and for those on distance learning in the on the discussion boards. But I'll just say, if we want to think about world making after empire as an example of that part of Robinson's contribution about the Black radical tradition and what it does, this can be a useful way of getting into the book. It also, there are many things that this book does, but and again, I don't want to really say very much because I'm interested in your own takes on it before hearing mine. But you might want to think about how the periodization in this book, how the importance of the World War I era and through to World War II is really essential to come to terms with thinking about decolonization after World War II. And then think about the title as well. Think about the ways in which decolonization for colonies to become independent countries, it's not a seamless and easy, just sort of, slight tinkering of the world order, but actually entails, as many of the politicians and thinkers that we see in that book really understood and pushed, entails a real remaking, a real reimagining of the world in ways that not only sort of compel our attention towards the interrelation between race and class, but maybe more significantly can help us to imagine ways in which those structures of power, those unequal structures of power, could be upended. And we can think about decolonization in that light as well. Okay, so those are just a few thoughts on racial capitalism as we head into this week in the module. I'm looking very forward to hearing your thoughts on the reading, on the idea of racial capitalism, on the race and class relationship, critiques you may have as well of course, maybe intersectional critiques of what is left out in thinking about race and class. What else might we want to put at the center of our analysis as well? So you'll want to think about those dimensions as you're reading and thinking. And we'll take it up from there on the discussion boards and in class. So I leave us here again on the Birmingham Canal. And the last thing I'll say is there's that thematic connection I wanted to mention about the canal and about what we're reading. What do the canals in Birmingham represent but, infrastructure from the Industrial Revolution? And so we can think about that as a story of capitalism, the movement of goods and people along these canals as the global industrial capitalist economy kind of got underway. But I think it would be remiss of us, at minimum, to not think about the significance of race and these canals, to think about the ways that the goods produced under conditions of racial slavery made their way perhaps back along these canals, the ways that soldiers and guns were sent out along these canals to police the British Empire in its forms of racial and economic and other forms of domination as well. So I'm here with you on the module for 2 other weeks besides this one, and I think I can think of a thematic place to kind of make a connection between lecturing outside and the content of the given weeks that we've got. So I'll see you next week, and I look forward to the discussion this week on racial capitalism. See you later.